Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. My name is Joey Fallon, and I was camping in the Rio Grande National Forest in Colorado in the summer of 2004. I wasn't particularly fond of RV camping, but after years of rushing paperwork as a mid-level accountant, I decided it was time to try something different. I had no family to talk about, no significant life events awaiting me back in the city, so parking my rented RV in the middle of nowhere seemed like the best course of action for me at 37. The peace and quiet were the last things I discovered there. The RV itself wasn't too bad. It was one of those newer models, sleek on the outside, but still filled with that distinct smell of cramped upholstery. I parked it close to the edge of a dense forest area, and the ranger had warned me about the trailheads, and I didn't pay much attention to the fact that they were marked for a reason, because I thought that if you had a GPS on the large, bright orange RV to help you find your way back, you could really get lost. By the second day, the loneliness began to get to me. I wasn't bored, but the silence in those woods felt like something was pressing down on me. I tried hiking some of the easier trails, staying close to the familiar paths, but there was a persistent sense of being watched. I assumed it was the deer, possibly a stray coyote or two, and I even made some sarcastic jokes about it to myself, like how I was going to become one of those stupid city guys you hear about on the news who think they can handle nature, but wind up getting lost and going missing. I wasn't that stupid, though, and on the third day I noticed something strange. I was walking back to the RV when I noticed a figure in the distance. It was too far away to see any details, but it was close enough to catch my attention. It was standing motionless, as if it had been planted in the middle of the woods. But for a moment I thought about waving or calling out, but something stopped me, like an unseen force pressing against my chest. It was most likely just another camper. Figured whoever or whatever it was slipped to the back of my mind after all. What were the chances that someone was out there staring at me in the middle of the woods? I told myself that there were a few other RVs parked a good few miles down, so it wasn't completely out of the question. But why just stand there? I shook it off, made my way back, and cooked up some canned beans like I had something better in the pantry. That night, when I woke up at around 2 in the morning, I wasn't even a lover of horror films. I was startled out of whatever lousy dream I was in by a faint thud outside the RV. It wasn't loud enough to be frightening, but it was noticeable enough to make me sit up in bed. The weight of the night crushing down felt thick like this time. It was more obvious that something or someone was moving outside the RV. I didn't own a gun, so I never felt the need for one after all what was going to happen. The oxygen wasn't moving properly, and I noticed that the woods outside the window were completely still. No wind, no animal sounds, just dead silence. That's the thing about being truly alone. Silence stops feeling peaceful and starts feeling unnatural. When I heard a scraping noise against the metal door, something deep inside me snapped to attention. I'm not a survivalist, but I wasn't about to sit there and wait for someone to walk right in. So I crept over to the door, hatchet in hand, and listened, determined to make sense of the sounds outside. I was more likely to twist my ankle in a ditch than to have to defend myself from some psycho in the woods. I flung it open, ready to swing, but all I could see was a dark stretch of trees and a slight breeze that had picked up and was rustling the branches. I didn't feel particularly comfortable, so I stepped outside slowly, looking around the RV for any clues as to what had caused the noise. There were some new scratches on the side of the door, long and jagged, like someone had run a sharp object across the metal. At that moment, I noticed the same figure standing at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the shadows. He was tall and lanky, with shoulders that seemed too wide for his body, and he was holding something, though I couldn't tell what it was from that distance, possibly a stick or a tool. I squinted to get a better look, but before I could move, he turned and disappeared back into the trees, as if he had never been there before. Any reasonable person would have packed up and left at that point, but I persuaded myself that it was just a random guy playing around, possibly a hiker who had lost their way, and I wasn't about to let some weirdo ruin my little getaway. The following morning, I made the decision to go to the closest town, partly to restock, but mostly to take a break from the tension that had begun to weigh on me. Even when I parked the RV in the town's grocery store lot, I caught myself looking over my shoulder, expecting to see that same figure standing there. Of course, he wasn't. I spoke to a local while buying some supplies in an attempt to casually bring up the strangeness I'd experienced. The drive into town wasn't long, but the entire time I felt like I was being followed by every car that passed me, and every shadow on the side of the road felt strange. You say, yeah, tall guy didn't get a good look, seemed off, though he gave me a slow nod with his fingers tapping against the counter. You ain't the first to mention it. Some folks say there's people out there don't care much for campers, if you get what I mean. I didn't. People like hunters. The elderly man behind the counter gave me a look, if he had heard this kind of thing before out in the forest. He didn't respond, just handed me my change, and gave me a look that said I should mind my own business. Naturally, I did the exact opposite. When I returned to the RV, I began searching the internet for any news about strange sightings in the forest. There wasn't much, just the typical warnings about bears and snakes. But then I came across a few posts buried in a backwater forum discussing hikers who'd gone into the forest and never came out. And a couple of them even mentioned strange figures watching them from the trees, just like I'd seen. The posts were from different years and different people, but the pattern was that there was someone, all on the fifth day. The sound began again, thuds, scratches, and the occasional crack of a branch, too close to the RV for comfort, and I barely slept, clutching the hatchet as if it were the only thing keeping me from collapsing. I should have left right away, packed up the RV, and headed for the closest interstate. But something kept me there out of curiosity or stupidity. This time, when I heard a low, drawn-out scraping sound against the back of the RV. It was intentional. I didn't hesitate. Instead, I put on my boots, grabbed the hatchet, and stormed outside, prepared to face whoever or whatever was out there. However, when I turned the corner, there was nobody there, not even a man in the trees or a figure peering from the shadows, just the RV with a deep, new gouge carved into its side. Something else was in the dirt near the back tire of the RV. There were large, heavy footprints, but they were going toward the trees, not away from the RV. I walked slowly over to a particular tree, my heart thumping so hard that I could hardly hear the wind in the trees. When I got close enough, I could see an old photograph that was crinkled and faded by the weather. The air felt heavier as I walked back to the RV, throwing whatever I could grab into the driver's seat, and I realized that whoever had been watching me wasn't just some random stranger who had been there close enough to take my picture and leave me this message. It was still clear enough to see that it was a picture of me standing outside the RV, probably taken shortly after I had arrived. As I pulled onto the road, I took one last look back at the clearing half, expecting to see that figure watching from the trees again. But there was nothing there, just the woods silent and motionless. Later, after I returned to civilization and had some time to process everything, I did a little more. I didn't care about the week I'd paid for, or the supplies I hadn't used. All I knew was that if I stayed a minute longer, I might not leave at all. Digging revealed that the man they call Finnegan Murphy had been in the area for years. Depending on who you asked, he may have been a hunter or a drifter, but all of the stories I read had one thing in common: people went missing while he was around music. In 2006, I visited Big Bend National Park, which is just outside of Tooele, Texas. My name is Ian Stokely, and let me tell you that I've never been the kind to enjoy busy campgrounds or cozy cabins. Instead, I prefer to park my RV in an area so remote that I can't see another person for miles. It's not really about peace and quiet. Rather, it's about freedom. After working in an office job that was making me feel suffocated for years, I wanted nothing more than to be outside without deadlines or bosses breathing down my neck. Rode and haven't looked back since it was intended to be a straightforward trip, a week-long getaway to Big Bend, one of my favorite places. If you haven't been, it's a huge area of desert, rocky mountains, and canyons that seem to go on forever. I love that the wilderness doesn't care about you, but it turns out that there are other things in the wilderness that care too much. I had parked my car in an off-the-beaten-path spot far down an unmarked dirt road. I wasn't armed because, to be honest, I never thought I'd need a gun. I've camped in bare country without any problems, and Big Ben had little more than the occasional mountain lion. As far as I was concerned, I was the most dangerous thing out here, but I was mistaken. The first couple of days were ideal. Just me, the RV, and the desert I'd wake up to. It wasn't a campsite exactly, just a flat open patch of dirt, surrounded by low brush and cactus. It felt like I was at the edge of the world. I felt like I could stay there forever, but on the third night, something changed. I just settled into bed and read by the dim light of a lantern when I heard what I thought were footsteps outside. I had woken up at dawn, made coffee on the propane stove, and sat outside in a folding chair, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. The only sounds in the desert were the wind rustling through the dry brush and the occasional caw of a distant crow. The paused listening could have been anything, a deer, perhaps, or a javelina, but it was enough to get me up and look out the window. The moonlight cast a pale glow over the landscape, but all I saw was my truck parked a few feet from the RV. I dismissed it and returned to my book, but the uneasiness lingered. When I did eventually fall asleep, it wasn't peaceful. I kept waking up. The day went by uneventfully enough, but that night it all came to a head when I was sitting outside enjoying a cold beer as the sun set and heard the footsteps again. This time closer. And this time they weren't random like an animal wandering through. Instead, they were deliberate, measured, and I stood up the haz. I had convinced myself that I was just being paranoid because every time I looked outside, there was nothing. When I first saw him, he appeared to be a shadowy figure standing about 50 feet away, partially obscured by a maquite bush. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching me. I called out, "Hey," but he didn't answer, and I had no idea why. The wind had stopped, and the desert was eerily silent. His face was gaunt, hollow, and cheeked, and his skin had that sunburned, weather-beaten look. What unnerved me the most was the way he moved slowly and deliberately, as if he had always been here. He stepped forward into the fading light, tall and lanky, maybe 6'3", dressed in dusty torn clothes, and I felt a cold knot of fear in my gut. There were no campers for miles as far as I knew. I stood there puzzled, unsure of what to do. I could have entered the RV and locked the door, but that would have felt like locking myself in. Instead, I approached my truck in a casual manner, as if I were just picking up something, and the man followed me exactly, maintaining the same distance. He didn't hurry or talk, just followed, and by the time I got to the truck, my hands were shaking so much that I fumbled for the keys. I dropped them in the dirt, stooped to pick them up, and then I heard his voice, low and gritty like sandpaper on stone. "Don't you?" I stopped cold, slowly got up, and turned around. He was about 10 feet away now, and I could see his cracked lips, his wild, matted hair, and something else, dried blood smeared across his shirt. His eyes narrowed, and I realized that this wasn't some lost hiker or strange desert dweller. Shouldn't be here. My mind racing, and I had nothing to defend myself with, only a tire iron in the truck. I was foolish for not bringing a gun, and it might as well have been a stick against this guy. I took a step back, but he mirrored me, closing the distance. My mind begged me to do something, but my instinct told me that moving too quickly might agitate him. I tried to keep my voice steady, my throat tight. "What do? It's not about what I want," he replied. "It's about what I need." His smile was unnerving, more like a twitch of his lips than anything else. Before I could respond, he lunged for me more quickly than I had anticipated. I staggered back, but his hands were all ready. He grabbed me by the throat and slammed me down onto the ground, pinning me. I struggled, thrashing beneath him, but he was stronger than he appeared. I could hardly breathe, my vision swimming as his hands squeezed on me, cold and rough. We struck the side of the truck, and I felt a sharp pain in my ribs where his elbow jammed into me. I lashed out, catching him across the jaw with my fist, but it hardly fazed him. He muttered something about blood or the desert taking what was rightfully mine. My hand fumbled aimlessly in the dirt until my fingers closed around a rough, jagged rock. Then, using all of my remaining strength, I swung it up and smashed it into the side of his head. He grunted, and for a brief moment, his grip relaxed, but it was enough, and I twisted out from under him, gasping for air. I didn't pause to consider. I took the tire iron from the back of the truck and swung it wildly, hitting his shoulder and knocking him back, but he didn't fall. I swung it harder this time, and it hit his head with a sickening thud, causing him to stagger to his knees with blood dripping from a gash above his temple. I stood there, gasping for air, the tire iron shaking in my hands. I should have run, but something inside of me broke the fear. My fear turned into something darker and more primordial, and I kept lowering the tire iron until the man stopped moving. When I did, my hands were covered in blood, and my chest was heaving. The man was lying crumpled at my feet, his head a jumble of blood and broken bones. I dropped the tire iron, my entire body trembling, and I staggered back to the RV, locked the door, and fell onto the bed. I didn't sleep that night, just lay there, staring at the ceiling while listening to the wind howling outside. The following morning, I discovered the man's body still there, undamaged, his clothes torn, and his face hardly recognizable. But in the light of day, I noticed something I had never seen before, intricate tattoos etched into his skin, possibly from old prison ink. Whoever he was, he wasn't just a lost soul in the desert. He had a past. I called the park rangers, and they appeared a few hours later. They asked me what had happened, and I told them. To my surprise, they didn't seem particularly shocked. It turned out that there had been missing persons reports in this area for years, but no one could ever prove anything. So they took the body away, and I left without asking many questions. I did some research later out of curiosity more than anything else. His name was Dallas Trammell, and he had been wanted for almost 10 years. As I drove away from Big Bend, I couldn't help but laugh at all the ways I thought this trip would end. The serial killer beating people down wasn't one of them. He was known for preying on campers and hikers, taking whatever he could from them before leaving their bodies out in the desert to rot. He was responsible for a string of murders throughout the Southwest. I'm still bringing a gun the next time. I'm Colby Simmons, and this incident occurred in the Ozark National Forest in 2005. I had spent the majority of my life working in construction, which has left my back sore and my temper a little short. So when I had the opportunity to spend a weekend in an RV, I seized the opportunity. For me, sitting in the middle of nowhere with only trees and silence always felt like a reset button. I was getting older, sure, but I didn't feel the need to slow down. It was just nice to I packed up the RV, got some food, grabbed some beers, and headed out. I had heard about a remote campground that had no phone signal and only a road leading up to it, but that was exactly what I wanted. No noise, no distractions. I arrived late in the afternoon, parked in a small clearing, and there were perfect trees all around, blocking out most of the sunlight. I stretched my legs and enjoyed the fresh forest air. The only thing missing was a fishing rod, but I wasn't complaining that night, because the wind whispered through the trees as if it had something amusing to say. I was looking for peace and quiet, but the quiet felt too loud. I'm not sure how else to describe it. There was something strange about the silence, but I shrugged it off and set up camp. It didn't take long for me to have a fire going, my chair perfectly propped up, and a cold one in my hand, when I heard heavy footsteps crunching through the underbrush at midnight. I was about to turn in when I realized that I was being paranoid, that the city noise had affected my head. I laughed it off, thinking that perhaps I had spent too much time arguing with contractors and clients back home. The animals weren't skittish. Instead, they were deliberate, slow and deliberate with each step, as if they knew I listened, telling myself I was just a camper wandering in late, probably lost or something. But after hearing those slow steps approach for another minute, my instinct told me otherwise. So I got up from my chair and looked around for movement. There was no light, no one calling out, just those damned footsteps pacing around the campsite's edges. Stupidly thought, what's the worst that could happen out here? And so I reached into the RV and grabbed the small hatchet I kept by the door. I was armed with nothing better because, well, the steps stopped dead silence again, and I started to feel like I was losing it. I called out, "Hey, you lost," but nothing came of it. I don't know what it was that made me stay, but I didn't go inside because something didn't feel right and I wasn't about to let someone sneak up on me. Instead, I stood there in front of the fire axe in hand, staring out at the trees like an idiot, waiting for something to happen. The fire crackled and the wind picked up a little, but whoever or whatever had been walking around was gone, or at least it sounded like it. When it did, the footsteps reappeared, but they were faster than before, as if someone was running. I turned my head in the direction of the sound and saw a man, or something that appeared to be a man, charging toward me from the trees. There was no light, only the sound of rustling branches and pounding feet, and he was approaching me quickly. I didn't think I had just swung the axe. I missed it. He tackled me forcefully, and the axe flew out of my hand. He was on top of me, and I could feel his hands around my throat. I tried to get him off by clawing at him and yelling or anything, but he was much stronger than he appeared. His clothes were torn and filthy, as if he had been living in the woods 4 weeks, and the smell coming from him made my stomach turn. I was able to knee him in the stomach enough to get some air and push him away, and then I scurried for the axe, but he grabbed my leg and pulled me back down, which is when I noticed the knife. I'm not sure how I managed to get back up on my feet, but I felt the panic rising in my chest as the rusted hunting knife from his belt swung at me, caught my arm, and ripped through the skin like butter. I kicked at him hard, hitting his ribs. Blood was dripping from my arm, and I grabbed the axe again, swinging wildly this time. And this time I didn't miss the blade hitting his shoulder, sinking deep, and he screamed as he came at me again with the knife raised high, but it wasn't enough to stop him. I threw myself aside, and he stumbled into the fire pit, scattering embers and sending flames skyward. He was on his feet again, staggered toward me, blood streaming down his arm from the axe wound, but he didn't stop. Fear moves you faster than you think. I took a metal rod from the fire pit and swung it at him, and the Ho-10 struck his face for the first time. He clutched his face and growled, "Yeah," and I growled back into the woods. Without wasting any time, I ran for the RV, slammed the door, unlocked it. My heart was racing so much that I thought I might faint, and blood was dripping onto the floor. I used a towel to wrap my arm in an attempt to stop the bleeding, and for what seemed like hours, I sat there listening and waiting. But nothing happened. I didn't sleep at all, and I didn't even blink. Every shadow outside the RV seemed to be moving, and every creak made my blood run cold. Eventually, morning arrived, bringing with it the light that made the entire situation seem like a bad dream, but it wasn't. I carefully exited the RV with an axe in case the fire pit was still smouldering, and there was blood on the ground, proving that it wasn't all in my head. I'm not sure who he was. I packed up faster than I've ever done in my life and left, but not before doing one last thing. I looked around the area where he had come from. What I saw sickened me. A makeshift camp hidden in the trees, a small, filthy tent covered in mud and leaves, and, I hoped, animal bones all around it. However, I knew deep down that there were too many. I drove directly to the closest town and reported everything, and the police arrived, asked questions, and searched the forest. Then the smell hit me, and I located the source, a shallow grave that was hastily covered with leaves and branches. Inside, I saw the remains of a human body. Whoever that man was, he had been killing for a while, and I nearly became his next trophy. His name was Yep Tucker, a local who had gone missing years ago. People thought he had run away or died somewhere, but he had been living out there and hunting people like animals. They never caught him, though he's still out there somewhere, in the woods. The last I heard, they closed off that area of the Ozarks because it was too dangerous, but I know the truth and I am just glad I made it. Though they didn't find him, they did find the bodies of multiple people. It was 2011. My name was Greg Healy, and I was in the middle of nowhere, somewhere between the damp mountains of the George Washington National Forest. I was one of those guys who thought they had camping all figured out, with plenty of food and enough solitude to escape the chaos of my 9-to-live life back in Richmond. I used to spend weekends out here, away from people, which is unusual for a guy. I had this nice RV, nothing fancy, but comfortable enough, and I parked it far off a gravel road miles from the closest town. I was planning a long weekend out here, cooking over the campfire, and maybe hiking if I felt up for it. The weather was nice, and I had the entire area to myself, so I thought I didn't bring a camera. It sounded like the dream, like me, who worked with spreadsheets all day, but it turns out some dreams need a wake-up call. Fire on this time, which was foolish in retrospect, but who needed one when you were meant to be in the middle of peaceful emptiness? Besides, I wasn't particularly concerned about wild animals, bears, wolves, and the like, and they generally avoided people. What I didn't account for was other people. The first night was peaceful, just me and the sound of crickets. I had the fire going, prepared some beans and sausages, and while enjoying a few beers and gazing up at the stars, I reflected on how fortunate I was to have been spared the never-ending cycle of deadlines and phone calls for a few days. Had I known what was ahead, I might have stayed in Richmond, even if it meant completing more spreadsheets. The following morning, I woke up with the strange sensation that something wasn't right. You know, when you're camping, you usually wake up to the sound of birds and rustling leaves, but there were no birds or wine, just silence. I initially dismissed it, thinking it might be the weather turning around. However, when I went outside the RV to stretch, I realized something was clearly wrong. My campsite appeared to have been disturbed, as if someone had been walking around while I was sleeping. At first, I thought maybe a deer or another animal had entered, but the footprints were too big and human-looking, and there were more of them than could be explained by a single person. I also discovered a pile of ashes close to the fire pit that hadn't been there the night before. I'm not easily alarmed, but this was unnerving. No one else should have been out here, and the closest campground was miles away, and even then, it wasn't the busiest time of year. I searched the woods for any indication of other campers, but nothing caught my attention, and I felt as though my instinct was telling me to leave. I packed a small bag and decided to go for a short hike to clear my head and see if I could get rid of this strange feeling. The trail I was following was barely visible, overgrown with ferns and thick brush, and about 2 meters in, I noticed things were getting weirder. At first, I thought it was just paranoia, but after the 3rd or 4th time, I stopped. I'm a stubborn idiot, walking and listening. I heard a soft, intentional crunch, and then I turned around, my heart racing, but all I saw were trees. I picked up the pace gradually at first, then more quickly, and by the time I returned to the RV, I was perspiring profusely from the silence of the woods, the footprints, and the fact that I was being followed. When I got there, I locked everything down, closed the blinds, closed the windows, unlocked the doors. By nightfall, I was still feeling uneasy, so I decided not to bother with the fire this time because I thought it might attract unwanted attention. I was inside, microwaving leftovers when I decided to spend the rest of the weekend keeping to myself, cooking my food, and enjoying my little piece of peace through the window. I didn't dare move and just stood there frozen by the tiny RV kitchen counter when I heard something outside, not footsteps this time, but something dragging and scraping along the gravel, and then there was a knock on the door light, which at first sounded more forceful, making it impossible for me to breathe. I don't know why, but something about that knock sent a rush of adrenaline through me, so I crept toward the window and pulled back the blinds just enough to see outside. A tall, disheveled man was standing directly outside my door, staring at it. His clothes were ripped, and his face looked gaunt as if he hadn't eaten in days. He was holding something like a crowbar, and my mind was racing. "Hey man, do you have any gas?" His voice sounded hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in a long time, and he wasn't looking at me, just waiting at the door. The man outside began pacing and muttering to himself while dragging the crowbar along the side of the RV. I couldn't understand what he was saying, but it wasn't friendly. He stopped again directly in front of the door and said, "Look, I just wasn't going to do much against a crowbar, but it gave me a sense of relief. I wasn't going to let this guy inside." But he slammed the crowbar against the door twice, and the entire RV shook. I retreated, thinking the locks would hold, but the door bent inward under the force. I frantically reached for the fire extinguisher next to the driver's seat and held it in front of me like a shield, but it splintered, caving in as he shoved it open. With a final, I sprayed the fire extinguisher in his face, saving me a moment or two, but he staggered, coughing, his eyes blinded by the foam. I didn't wait, so I ran for the driver's seat, turned the ignition key, and floored it. The RV lurched forward, wheels spinning in the gravel. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw the man stumbling after me, crowbar still in hand, vanishing into the darkness. As when I arrived at the police station an hour later, they took my statement and asked me to describe the man. That's when the real horror set in. He wasn't just some drifter looking for gas. A few weeks prior, a family had vanished from a campsite not far from where I had parked, in the same area. The RV sped down the narrow road, and I didn't stop until I hit a gas station at dawn. I was shaken, to be sure, but I hadn't taken in the situation yet. He had been squatting in the woods for months robbing campers, and worse, the police never found the family's bodies, just the wreckage of their campsite. I guess I got lucky and left the RV scene behind for good after selling it for a low price. The cop showed me a picture of the man down to the crowbar, with the same sunken face and torn clothes. I thought it was a great idea to move my RV deep into the Tonto National Forest in Arizona in 2001. I had been RV camping for a few years. Nothing fancy, just me, my rig, and the peace of nature. While some people find peace in yoga or therapy, I found mine in being as far away from the outside world as possible. His name was Nolan Crest Music, and my name is Comrade Zeller. This weekend was supposed to be as free of people as possible, with some solitude, a few beers, and maybe a hike or two if I felt ambitious. You know that feeling you get when you know something's wrong, but you can't quite pinpoint it? That was me the moment I parked the RV. There were no campers, hikers, or even the occasional wanderer who would get lost and ask for directions. That should have been my first warning sign, but I chose to ignore it, thinking I had reached the ideal level of total seclusion. The Tonto National Forest is a huge place with more hidden spots than people realize. If you're not careful, you can disappear without anyone noticing. I suppose that's why it appeals to some people like me. However, as I unpacked my gear, something gnawed me in the back of my mind. It was too quiet, not just the usual. I dismissed it at the time, because there was a hollow kind of quiet with no birds or rustling leaves. Perhaps the animals were also on vacation. By late afternoon, I made the decision to explore a little because I wanted to stretch my legs and had no specific destination in mind. The trail I chose was faint and hardly recognizable, and it was definitely not on any of the maps. There was something appealing about the prospect of discovering something undiscovered and hidden. It felt like I had crossed some invisible boundary, leaving the everyday world behind. And then I noticed an old rusted-out truck half buried in a ditch. Perhaps it was the illusion of discovery, or perhaps it was because I had had too many beers and wasn't thinking clearly, but I followed the path for about an hour. The scenery gradually changed from lush greenery to more rugged rocky terrain. Something you'd expect to find in a junkyard, not out here in the middle of nowhere. Curious, I moved closer and saw the cabin, which was tiny and nearly invisible, tucked behind a stand of trees. There was no smoke coming from a chimney, no sign of life, just this dilapidated building sitting there like a forgotten relic. I'm not sure why, but perhaps I was still high from the door creaked when I pushed it open, revealing a single room with a sagging roof and broken windows. It smelled like rot, and I could hear the faint drip of water somewhere. The floor was covered in dust and dirt, as if no one had been here in years. But that wasn't the worst part. The back wall was completely covered in old Polaroids. Perhaps I should have avoided this little adventure. I backed away, my stomach churning, but then I noticed something else in the corner of the room, barely visible under a pile of old blankets. A duffel bag. It was too new for this place to clean, and I felt a sudden rush of adrenaline, like a rush. There were hundreds of them, each one depicting a person, or rather what was left of them. They weren't just people, though these photos had been taken after something had been done to them. Mutilations, missing limbs, faces frozen in horror. My heart was racing as I huddled behind a collapsing counter, hoping that whoever it was hadn't seen me. I didn't have a gun, which is the dumbest part of all this. I'd never felt the need to carry one before. So what was I going to do? Every nerve in my body was screaming for me to get the hell out of there, but I couldn't move until I made a decision. I really wished I had a deer, but now that the footsteps were getting closer and more deliberate, I dared to peek out the window and saw a man standing near the truck, looking gaunt and dirty, with what appeared to be a crowbar in one hand and tattered clothes. He turned slowly, scanning the area, but I couldn't see his face clearly, and something about his movements made my skin crawl. He wasn't searching. He was. I waited for what seemed like hours, crouching and barely breathing. I considered running, but every time I tried to move, the floor creaked under my weight, trapping me. The only way out was through him. Just when I thought he might go, he did something that made me feel extremely cold. He took a Polaroid camera out of his pocket, took a picture of the truck, turned slowly in the direction of the cabin, lifted the camera, and pointed it straight. But when the shutter clicked and the window froze, I lost it. I scurried to the door, trying to be as silent as possible, but my foot caught on something and I crashed into the wall. The noise was so loud that there was no way he hadn't heard it. I did not dare turn around and ran toward the trail, hearing his footsteps pounding faster and faster behind me. I'm not sure how long I ran. My lungs, my legs felt like they were going to give out, and my legs were burning, but I couldn't stop. The sun was going down, the forest was getting darker, and it became harder to see the trail. Eventually, I realized I was lost and had left the path, so I found a small clearing and collapsed behind a fallen log, gasping for air. I couldn't hear him anymore, but I knew he was still waiting, so my mind raced trying to think of where I must have fallen asleep at some point, because the next thing I knew, it was completely dark and the forest was once again very quiet. I remained hidden and hardly moved, listening for any sign of him, but the longer I waited, the more I began to question whether I had imagined it all or if it was just some weirdo who enjoyed taking pictures of old trucks. Instead, all I could think about was those Polaroids and the people in them. And I was wondering if I would be the next. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, camera in hand, staring directly at me. I didn't think, I just ran, but I pushed through, darting between the faint click and the unmistakable sound of a Polaroid camera. My heart leapt into my throat, and I held my breath, praying he hadn't found me another click closer. For a moment, I thought I was safe, but then I heard the familiar click of the camera outside the window, so I pressed the gas pedal and sped down the road as fast as the RV could manage. I don't know how I did it, but eventually I stumbled onto the road, with the lights of my RV barely visible in the distance. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. Didn't stop until I arrived at the closest town. A few hours later, I told the local sheriff about everything, but by the time they sent someone out, the cabin had burned down, and there was no sign of the man or the Polaroids. A few days later, I conducted some research of my own and discovered that Errol Thompson had vanished from the area years prior. He was suspected of killing multiple hikers, but they only discovered hundreds of photos of him instead of any bodies. I'm not big on souvenirs, but my name is Harvey Galloway, and in 2017 I made the decision to take an RV trip deep into the Awatcha National Forest in Arkansas. Growing up, I had spent a lot of time in the area, so I kept the Polaroid I found stuffed in my RV door the following morning. It shows a picture of me, taken from the clearing, suggesting that Errol is still using a camera music. The woods with my dad learning how to hunt deer and fish for bass, but I hadn't camped out like this in years. You know how life goes, and before you know it, you're 35 years old, working long hours at a job, tolerate, and the thought of taking a real break seems like a pipe dream. So I bought this old RV, packed it up, and set out because I wanted some peace and quiet to clear my head, and perhaps even go fishing. The Ida Forest had the ideal combination of the first thing I noticed was how still everything was. No birds, no crickets, just the wind through the trees. I assumed it might be the time of year or the area, because you hear people talk about that spooky quiet in the woods, but I dismissed it as nerves. I had parked near a stream, thinking I could get a good few days of fishing in and maybe read a book or two. It was remote enough to feel isolated, but not so far that I couldn't return to civilization if necessary. I wasn't one for superstitions, so I set up camp, built a small fire, and sat by the stream with a beer. Hours went by with nothing exciting happening, and the initially unsettling silence began to feel peaceful, a sort of forced combat. By the second night, that peace was broken, and I woke up to what I thought was a tapping sound, like something knocking against the side of the RV. I assumed it was a tree. I ignored it at first, thinking it might be a branch or an animal, but it kept coming back, tapping, tapping, and tapping. I got a flashlight, put on a jacket, and went outside to check, but there was nothing there, no wind, no branches, and definitely no animal lurking nearby, just my imagination. However, when I turned to go back inside, I saw something in the dirt close to my bare RV footprints. In an attempt to dispel the uneasiness, I climbed back inside and locked the door. It wasn't exactly an armored fortress, but it was better than standing out in the open. I'm used to encountering strange people. While camping you get drifters and people trying to live off the grid, but these prints were new. Someone had been walking barefoot around my RV in the middle of the night. I looked around with my flashlight, but there was nothing else, no sign of movement. I found more footprints around the RV the following morning, this time leading toward the trees, as if whoever had been watching me had vanished into the woods. I had had enough and packed up, deciding to end the trip early because my RV wouldn't start no matter how I tried. I also grabbed the shotgun I kept under my bed in case the night was restless, and I barely slept. I tried turning the key several times, but all I got was a series of clicks. I decided to check the engine because maybe I could fix it. But as soon as I opened the hood, I discovered that someone had cut the fuel line. Panic struck because I was stuck miles from the closest town, and someone was watching me. I considered walking back to the highway, but that was at least 15 miles away. Perhaps I could find about an hour into the hike. I noticed something ahead that at first glance appeared to be a bundle of rags caught in the branches. But as I got closer, the smell hit me. It wasn't rags. It was a man strung up in the dirt road. I grabbed my backpack, loaded it with supplies, and headed toward the dirt road that had brought me into this mess. I stumbled back, almost dropping my backpack in shock, wondering what kind of person would do this and, more importantly, what was waiting for me if I didn't leave quickly. I kept moving, keeping my eyes on the trees, but every sound made me jump. Hours went by, and I hadn't seen a single car or person, and the woods were eerily quiet, like the whole forest was holding its breath, when I heard the faint sound of something moving quickly behind me. I turned to look around the trail, but nothing was there, so I accelerated my pace. I eventually came to an old cabin that was partially hidden behind overgrown trees. I didn't remember seeing it on the way in, but I thought maybe the people who lived there could help. I knocked on the door, but nothing came. I started to back out when I noticed that the wall scratched into the wood contained symbols and words in some sort of foreign language, or perhaps just gibberish. But there was one word I recognized: run. I didn't need any more persuasion, so I ran out of the cabin and didn't stop until I was back on the trail, my legs burning. The door creaked open on its own this time. The place appeared to be abandoned. Dust covered everything, and there was an overpowering smell of rot. The man's lungs were burning, but I continued to run until I saw him standing just off the trail. He was covered in dirt and grime, and his clothes were torn as if he had been living here for years. But what really caught my eye was the knife in his hand. He smiled a sickly, twisted grin, and I didn't wait. I turned and ran as quickly as I could, hearing his footsteps behind me get closer. He was moving too quickly for someone who I had barely reached a clearing when I heard him stop. I turned around, panting, and saw him standing there, watching me like a hunter letting his prey run before closing in. I had no idea why he stopped, but I wasn't going to question it, so I continued driving until I reached a dirt road where I collapsed. A car pulled up beside an old, beat-up truck, and the driver stopped. He looked at me, half crazy, and probably half out of breath. We drove in silence for a while before he finally said, "You're lucky, because most don't make it out once he's marked him," who I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. I told him everything that had happened, including the body, the man in the woods, and the cabin. He didn't say anything, just nodded and motioned for me to get in. I didn't argue. When we got to town, I was too shaken to think clearly, so I reported the body to the local authorities. They didn't seem surprised and told me they'd look into it, but I had a feeling that wasn't going to happen because they probably already knew. They call him the Feral Man, and he's been out here for decades. No one knows why or what he wants, but he always leaves a mark on bodies, sometimes trophies. Perhaps they were afraid or didn't want to deal with it, but who knows? I sold the RV, never went camping again, and I haven't returned to Arkansas. As for the Feral Man, I'd like to think he's still out there, stalking those woods for his next trophy, but that's not my problem anymore. In 2011, I was camping in West Virginia's Monongahela National Forest by myself with my RV and some fishing gear. I'm Noah Langford, a mechanic who grew up in the small town of Ripley. You could say that I have a knack for fixing things and keeping to myself. I wasn't there for any in-depth introspection. I just wanted some time to relax and maybe go fishing. It's funny how things never quite go as planned, but the RV park was pleasant enough, a gravel lot surrounded by dense trees. It was late afternoon, and I had just set up camp with the folding chair out, cooler packed, fishing rod leaning against the RV, when I noticed something a little off. The campsite next to mine was empty, not just the typical empty homes, but abandoned, with a couple of folding chairs tipped over a fire pit that still had some embers smouldering and, initially, what I thought was a half-eaten sandwich on the table. Perhaps they went on a hike and ended up staying longer than anticipated, but something about it felt strange, like they simply disappeared while they were engaged in whatever activity they were engaged in. Perhaps my imagination was playing tricks on me, but I couldn't get rid of the feeling, so I occupied myself with dinner, setting up the small propane grill, and eating a few burgers, but my head was still on that deserted campsite. Why would they leave like that? It wasn't even dark yet, and the RV park wasn't very large. It was just after dark when things started to get really weird. The first thing I noticed was the sound. You spend enough time outside, and you get used to the noises, the rustling of trees, the distant calls of wildlife. I had not seen a single person since I pulled in, and I wasn't armed. I'm a mechanic, not a survivalist, but I was beginning to regret that decision as I looked around the peaceful, isolated area. But this time, everything seemed to stop. There were no crickets or wind, and then there was a low, murmuring conversation coming from the direction of the abandoned campsite. I tried to listen, but the words were too jumbled, so I took a few steps toward the trees to try to make sense of it. But then I noticed a tall, lanky man wearing a flannel standing about 50 yards away from the edge of the woods. Something about him felt off right away, but I couldn't quite place it. I called out to him in a casual way, like, "You all right, buddy?" But he just stood there without answering. I took a step closer, and as I did, he turned and vanished into the trees without making any noise. I froze. I don't get scared easily, but this guy said I didn't want to be out there alone, so I backed up toward my RV with my heart thumping. I locked the door behind me and grabbed my phone in the hopes of calling the park office, the ranger station, or anyone else, but there was no signal, and the silence outside was unsettling. Then I heard slow, deliberate footsteps directly outside my RV. The thing about being in an RV is that you can't hear Fort Knox. The footsteps circled once before, stopping at the door. My mind was racing, so I thought, should I try to scare him off by pretending I had a gun? I decided to keep quiet in the hopes that he would lose interest and leave. Then, as he tried to enter, the door handle rattled, catching my breath in my throat. I stood there frozen, wondering if I should rush him. But what if he was armed? The handle rattled again, more forcefully this time. The only thing I had that looked like a weapon was a wrench from the toolbox, so I grabbed it in case he got inside. The door jostled once more before going still, and I don't know how long I stood there clutching that wrench as if my life depended on it, but eventually the footsteps disappeared into the distance. I wasn't about to go outside and check, though, so I spent the rest of the night on edge, barely sleeping every little creak. I opened the door cautiously, expecting the worst, but nothing was out of place, no tracks, no signs of anyone, just the empty campsite next to mine, as eerie as ever. I promptly packed up, throwing things haphazardly into the RV, ready to flee. But as I turned the key, something caught my eye. Just my stomach turned against my better judgment, so I grabbed a stick and walked over, poking at the loose dirt. A flash of blue fabric, and then I saw the hand pale and lifeless sticking out from the earth. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat, because there was a small mound of disturbed earth maybe 20 yards in, and it looked fresh, like someone had just buried something. When I told the rangers what I had discovered, they didn't seem overly surprised. It turned out that a few campers had gone missing in the last month, all of them last seen close to that RV park. I thanked them for the tip, but I could tell that this guy was dangerous in the woods. I scurried back to the RV, slammed the door shut, and floored it out of there, the tires kicking up gravel as I peeled away. If there's one thing I've learned from that trip, it's that fixing engines is far safer than spending nights in the woods. They weren't holding out much hope of finding the guy, so I did some research on my own, and the name that kept coming up was Malcolm Reeves, who was a park ranger before he was fired for disturbing behavior. No one really knew what happened to him after that, so I assumed he found his way back to the forest, and judging by that mound of dirt, I wasn't the only one he'd been stalking. I'm Garrett Blaine, and back in the fall of 2011, I was doing what I thought would be a peaceful camping trip in the Ozark National Forest. He's still out there somewhere waiting for his next opportunity to strike, though I'd guess he's not picky about who he's with. If you ever find yourself in Maningala National Forest, maybe avoid the RV park. The RV I rented wasn't fancy, just a beat-up vehicle that looked like it had seen its fair share of dubious road trips. I was a tech worker who was always glued to my laptop, drinking cold brew, and living on takeout in a small apartment in Little Rock. I wasn't a nature person, but my girlfriend at the time had dumped me, and the idea of some solitude sounded nice. A few days without Wi-Fi and human contact didn't seem like the worst way to decompress. After a couple of hours of driving and one near-deer encounter, I found a clearing deep enough into the forest that I wouldn't be disturbed by other campers, just trees quiet, and an old dirt trail leading deeper into the woods. The engine sputtered. The brakes winded louder than a toddler in a candy aisle, but it moved, so that was good enough for me. The first night went without incident. The stars above, which I hadn't seen in their full splendor in years, gave me a sense of calm that I didn't know I needed. I even managed to sleep soundly, which was unusual for me, while listening to the sounds of the forest and grilling some burgers on a small propane stove. It was so serene that I nearly forgot why I had come out there in the first place to escape. People, life, and everything. I took a walk along that dirt trail to stretch my legs. It wasn't marked, but it was obvious that it must have been used frequently, possibly by hikers or hunters, so I assumed it would loop back around to the clearing. However, when I came across the cabin, it wasn't on any map and didn't look like one of those quaint forest cabins that people rent out for vacations. No, this thing was dilapidated. Curiosity overcame me, and I regret it to this day. I tried to look inside without getting too close, but the darkness inside ate up any details, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had no one around all day, but all of a sudden I felt like I was being watched. The roof was sagging in some places, the windows were boarded up, and the door was slightly ajar and creaked in the breeze. It was late afternoon when I returned to the RV, and I dismissed the unsettling feeling as simply being anxious from being alone in the middle of nowhere. However, as night fell, the feeling grew stronger, so I locked the door, something I hadn't bothered to do the night before, and double-checked all the windows just in case. At midnight, I heard something, initially thinking it was just an animal, possibly a deer or a raccoon, but the more intently I listened, the more I heard the sounds, until they turned into footsteps, circling the RV. The footsteps stopped. Then, there was a soft thud against the side of the RV. I held my breath, clutching the cast iron skillet I had been using for breakfast. It wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing. It felt like someone or something was pacing around it, testing it. My heart began racing, so I grabbed the only weapon-like object I had. I'm not sure how long I remained frozen with the skillet in my hands, waiting for whatever it was to try to break in, but it never did. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have fallen asleep, though I hardly remember it. My brain was screaming for me to start the engine and drive, but the keys were on the counter, and the last thing I wanted to do was make noise by moving another thud, louder this time, by the door. The following morning, after spending too much time alone, I cautiously went outside to inspect the RV's perimeter, half expecting to find scratches or marks, but finding no evidence of anything or anyone having been there. I tried to tell myself that it was all in my head, but then I noticed faint but distinct human barefoot footprints leading away from the RV and back toward the trail. In the eye got a shiver going in the direction of that cabin. Someone had been out there, circling my RV in the dead of night, just watching. I didn't waste any time packing up my belongings because this solo camping trip was at an end. I jumped in the driver's seat, turned the key, and nothing happened. The engine sputtered like it had before, but now it was worse, like it was trying to catch my stomach. So I tried again. And once more, but the RV was dead, and I was stuck when I saw him. He was standing at the edge of the clearing, just where the trees started to thicken. He was a tall, gaunt man with a dirty, torn flannel shirt and a tangled beard. The shadows mostly covered his face, but I could see that he was grinning, not the kind of smile you give a stranger you pass, but a slow, purposeful grin that made my skin crawl. As though that would somehow keep him out, I scurried back into the RV and locked the door again. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal. Of course, I hadn't seen a bar since arriving at the RV. I sat there listening for any movement, but it was completely silent outside. And then there was a tap on the window, not a knock, but a slow, steady tap as if he was playing with me. I didn't have a gun. I had never needed one before, and to be honest, I wasn't going to wait around to see what happened next. So I grabbed my backpack, put in some necessities, water, a flashlight, and my phone. I knew it wasn't much use, but it was all I had, so I grabbed the skillet again. I looked through the window, but he was gone, and the door rattled just once, like someone testing the lock, and opened the RV's rear window, thinking that if I couldn't drive out, I would walk. The closest road was about 5 miles away, so I reasoned that if I could just reach it, I'd be safe. I climbed out of the window, landing awkwardly on the ground, and began moving as quickly as I could through the woods, expecting him to be right behind me, but he wasn't yet. I made it a couple of miles before I heard footsteps again. I'm not proud of how that chase went. I stumbled more times than I'd like to admit, tripping over roots and rocks, my legs burning with each step, but I didn't stop until I reached a small creek and crossed over to the other side. This time, I ran faster, shining my flashlight into the trees, and there he was, sprinting toward me with a look of pure insanity on his face. My heart almost exploded in my chest, so I did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually I reached the road and, by some miracle, a passing car came up. I flagged it down, breathless and wild-eyed, probably looking like I had just escaped an asylum. The driver, an older man with a shotgun in his passenger seat, didn't ask many questions, just nodded and let me run. That's when I heard the scream. It wasn't me, it was him. After I had moved away from the Ozarks, I did some digging and discovered that the man's name was Lucas Farnham. Local authorities had been searching for him for years, and he had been living in those woods, preying on campers, hikers, and anyone who ventured too far off the beaten path. He never returned to that RV, and I didn't even call to have it towed. As far as I know, it's still sitting there rusting away in that clearing. Was never apprehended, and the bodies they discovered, well, let's just say they weren't intact, and no, I never went RV camping again. It turns out that solitude isn't always the solution to problems. My name is Jesse Carlson, and I went to Idaho's Payette National Forest for the first time in 1998. Yes, I know what you're thinking, Idaho potatoes, but it turns out that there's a lot more in those. I wasn't prepared for what I discovered, because I wasn't one of those people who would spend their entire lives outdoors. I grew up in Chicago, where the only wildlife is pigeons, and the majority of the wilderness is in the park down the street. However, in my 30s, I began to think that maybe a little quiet would be nice, so I bought myself an RV, and before I knew it, I was traveling, itching for some adventure. The national forest seemed ideal. It was remote, but not too remote like the trip was going great, with plenty of space, no annoying neighbors, and the sound of the wind through the trees. I was taking it easy, but then I met Roger, who wasn't your typical forest dweller, and wasn't the kind of guy you expect to meet out in the woods, especially not in a place like Payette. It was a beginner's wilderness experience, you know, where You can still get help if your tires blow out or, God forbid, you run out of coffee. I was parked in a small clearing that felt remote, but was still close to a dirt road. Roger looked like he had been walking for miles, or was possibly lost. His skin was pale from too many days without adequate shelter, and his clothes, I'm not sure how to put this politely, looked like he had been on a fashion fasting spree for months. However, there was something else about Roger's face, or rather the total absence of his arms were covered in long, jagged slashes that crisscrossed over each other like some sort of map of his misery. And no, it wasn't like he'd just fallen into a thorn bush or anything. At first, these seemed intentional. His hair was matted and stuck to his scalping clumps, but that didn't frighten me as much as his expression. Imagine speaking to a breathing mannequin. Roger didn't respond. He just kept staring without blinking or twitching, and he didn't even breathe loud enough for me to notice. I thought he might have needed help because he appeared to have gone weeks without seeing another human. So I got out of the RV and tried to be all neighborly. "Hey, you all right, man?" I asked casually, hands on my hips, thinking perhaps he had wandered away from a campsite or something. I should have been smarter, because I've seen enough bad TV to know when someone is going to lose it. But in that moment, I just thought, what's the worst that could happen? "I'm Jesse Carlson, and I have an RV with locks." Who was this guy going to hurt anyway? Need a ride back to the road? I asked again, sounding a little more strained this time, and he moved away from me, taking a few steps back, his lips curving slightly, but not into a smile, but more like he knew something I didn't. And then suddenly he dropped his backpack, which hit the ground with a loud thud. I wasn't afraid of the bag, but rather of the two knives that fell out, long hunting knives, perhaps, but not the kind of blades you'd use to gut a deer, because they had seen something much worse, and my heart rate increased instinctively when I saw them. Kicked in, I backed toward the RV while pretending to be calm, but in my mind, I was calculating how quickly I could slam the door shut and leave. Roger, however, wasn't in a rush. He leaned slowly as you asked, picked up the knives, and stared at me with the same vacant expression. This man wasn't lost. He wasn't in need of assistance. He was hunting. I ran for the RV without even checking to see if he was following me. My only decision was to enter and lock the door. I heard a loud thud against the metal as soon as I slammed the door shut. One of those knives had struck the door, and if I had been even a fraction of a second slower, it would have been me. Now, this is the part where you would think that I would have grabbed my gun and fought back, but I stupidly believed that I would be safe in an RV with some pepper spray and a pocket knife. I realized my big mistake, though, because I could hear Roger moving around outside the RV as if he was waiting for me to move, and all I had was the flimsy. We were miles away from the closest ranger station, and my phone wasn't working for a while, so I just sat there listening and waiting for him to make contact. I could see the shadow of his feet beneath the door, pacing back and forth like some caged animal. My heart was thumping in my chest, and I could hear my own breathing. The next move, I realized that he wasn't just pacing. Instead, he was slowly and methodically cutting and scraping the blade of one of those knives along the side of the RV, as if he were playing a twisted game. It was the kind of sound that gets under your skin and makes your bones vibrate, and when it stopped, I assumed he had given up and had gone. But as I was about to calm down, I heard a loud bang from the back of the RV. Enter through the back window. I leapt to my feet, searching for anything I could use as a weapon. I discovered a tire iron hidden beneath the sink, so I decided it was better than nothing. I hurried to the back just in time to see his dirty hand slowly pushing the window up. I slammed the tire iron down on his fingers, and he didn't scream or even make a sound, just yanked his hand back. Then there was silence once more, my heart thumping so strongly. I remained there, leaning against the wall and clutching the tire iron as if it were my lifeline. The seconds passed slowly, and then a voice called out, "Let me in." I'm not sure how he knew my name, but hearing it in that eerie, hollow voice sent shivers down my spine, and my mind raced. He persisted in tapping on the window repeatedly, like a predator playing with its prey, saying, "You can't stay in there forever." He was right that I couldn't, but I also wasn't about to let him butcher me like some backwards psycho. I'm not sure how long we played this game, when he waited outside while I barricaded inside, but eventually it stopped after what seemed like hours. I peeked through the blinds and he was gone, or at least not right outside the RV anymore. I thought maybe I'd scared him off, or maybe he just got bored, but I wasn't about to stick around. I heard his footsteps retreat, crunching on the dirt and gravel outside, but I didn't move around and discover that I started the engine and drove away without turning around. I thought I was safe, but when I finally pulled into the closest town, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. A name, Roger Fenn, written in jagged letters on the side of the RV, followed by the words "next time." I later learned who he was known for his hobby and had escaped from a nearby mental hospital years prior. However, the worst part is that the authorities informed me that Roger was supposed to have been killed in a hit-and-run 3 years prior to my first visit to that forest. It's funny because in 2006, I drove my RV up to the San Juan National Forest in Colorado. My name was Derek Jensen, and I was a guy who loved the quiet for 10 years at the time. I bought this old RV and began going on camping trips to recharge my batteries because I was craving solitude more than a steady paycheck from running a hardware store. The thing about RV camping in the middle of nowhere is that it's peaceful until it's not. That morning, I drove out of Durango and headed down a logging road that seemed to have been abandoned since the last ice age, with no cell service, no other campers, just the wind in the trees and the smell of pine. I planned to spend a few days relaxing, reading, and possibly going hiking. I set up camp next to a small creek, built a fire, and opened a beer. Everything was going perfectly until I heard a sound. At first, I assumed it was an animal rustling in the bushes, possibly a deer or raccoon, but it wasn't the kind of noise animals make. Rather, it was intentional, like someone walking. Now, I'm not a paranoid person, but I'm also not a moron. I got up, went to the edge of the campsite, and listened to the noise stop. I assumed it was just my imagination after too many nights of reading crime thrillers, so I told myself it was nothing, and then I went back to my fire. About 30 feet away, I noticed a man who appeared to be in his 50s. He was wearing ripped jeans and a flannel shirt, and his hair was matted and tangled like he hadn't taken a shower in years. His clothes appeared to be part of the thing that struck me was not his appearance. He was stiff, greasy, and covered in dirt, but rather his smile, a big, toothy smile that stretched too far, as if he had just been told a joke I didn't know. He didn't say anything, just stared at me with that smile, as if I were the punchline to whatever sinister thought was going through his mind. "Need something?" I asked, my voice attempting to remain steady. "Nothing, just that smile plastered on his face." I slowly reached behind me to find the hatchet I'd used to split firewood earlier. I'd never been much of a fighter, but I wasn't going to stand there like a deer in headlights while some creepy guy decided what to do with me. The man didn't move. Instead, he continued to watch, that smile twitching as if he was barely controlling whatever was going on in his head. Suddenly, he took a step forward, tried to look more confident than I actually felt by grabbing the hatchet and holding it in front of me. His smile grew, which I didn't think was possible, and then he began to laugh, a low, guttural laugh that didn't sound right, but it wasn't a laugh of humor. Rather, it was something darker that made my stomach turn. He took another step, and that's when I realized that this wouldn't end without someone getting hurt. Perhaps he was just a nut job, someone who went too far into the woods and lost his mind, or perhaps he had worse ideas. I turned and ran for the RV in the hopes that I could get inside and lock the door before he got to me. But as I was running, I heard his boots thudding against the dirt more quickly than I had anticipated. I threw myself into the RV and slammed The door shut, but as soon as he got there, his hands struck the glass, leaving greasy smears, and he attempted to claw his way inside. I locked the door, my heart racing. I didn't know what his problem was, but I knew I had to leave. I turned on the ignition in the hopes that the old RV would start the first time, and it sputtered, coughed, and then roared to life. The man didn't move. Instead, he just stood there watching me as I backed out of the campsite, his eyes fixed on mine until I found a small town and pulled into a gas station. My hands were shaking as I filled up the tank, my mind still reeling from the encounter. I drove for what seemed like hours, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Who was that guy? Why was he out there? And why did he target me? I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see him running after the RV, but the road remained empty. I tried to act normal when I went inside to pay, but the man behind the desk must have noticed my expression and asked, "Are you okay, dude?" He inquired, his eyes worried, and I was unsure of how to respond. "Yeah, I just had a strange encounter with someone in the woods," he said, raising an eyebrow. "You've been up near the San Juan forest?" I nodded, and he leaned closer. "A few people have gone missing up there over the years, and the local sheriff has never found anything, but people talk, and I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't help but feel uneasy." "What kind of people are there?" "A couple hikers, mostly campers, and people say there's a guy out there who may be a hermit and live off the land, but he stopped looking around the stores if he didn't want anyone to overhear. But some say he ain't. I don't know if it's true, but you hear stories." I paid for the gas and drove away without saying anything else because my mind was racing with what the man had told me. Could that man in the woods have been the cause of those disappearances? I didn't want to stay behind to find out. I returned to the RV and set out to drive as far away from that forest as I could, but as I did, I noticed something. He was smiling and standing by the side of the road in the rearview mirror. I slammed on the gas, my heart pounding, as the RV sped down the highway. There was no way he could have followed me or kept up with the RV, but 4 hours I drove with my eyes fixed on the road ahead and my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Even though I hadn't packed a bag, I found a motel and checked in when I finally pulled into a larger town. I needed to sleep to clear my head, but as soon as I lay down, I couldn't stop thinking about that twisted, unnatural smile that made my skin crawl. I didn't get much sleep that night, and when I did fall asleep, it wasn't for long because I woke up in a cold sweat to the sound of I initially thought it was a dream. But then I heard it again. Someone was walking outside my room. I grabbed the hatchet I had brought in from the RV and scampered to the window, my heart thumping. He was standing outside, staring at the door with that same smile, and my stomach dropped. I retreated from the window, my mind racing, wondering how he had found me and how he had followed me all this way. I didn't have time to figure it out. I heard the doorknob rattle, so I threw open the door without thinking and swung the hatchet as hard as I could. It struck something solid, and I heard a grunt of pain. The man staggered back, clutching his shoulder where the hatchet had lodged itself. He looked up at me, his smile still there, but now twisted in pain, and blood spattered his shirt from the wound. He didn't stop, though, and took a step. I stumbled backward, my hands shaking and my heart racing, as if the injury didn't even faze him. I didn't know what to do next, and as he approached, that grin became even more terrifying in the dim light. My brain was screaming for me to do something, but my body wasn't moving quickly enough. The man yanked the hatchet out of his shoulder, as if it were nothing, and his eyes were fixed on me as he stepped through the door. His once unsettling smile had transformed into something monstrous, and I had no idea how he was still standing, much less approaching me. Blood was dripping from the wound through his tattered flannel shirt, but he continued to move forward as if he was unaware of it. I snatched the lamp off the motel nightstand and swung it at him. It shattered against his head, sending glass and ceramic fragments flying everywhere, but it hardly slowed him down. My mind was racing with ideas of how I was going to survive this, so I grabbed the toilet lid and held it in front of me like a makeshift shield. Then the banging began, and the bathroom door shook violently as he pounded on it, the thin wood creaking under the force. I had no plan, just the desire to get out of there. So I ran toward the bathroom, slamming the door shut behind me and jamming the flimsy lock. I put my weight against the door to keep it closed, but I knew it wouldn't last long because the door splintered. I threw the toilet lid at him as hard as I could when he burst through the jagged edges of the door frame, catching on his clothes as he forced his way in. The lid hit him square in the chest, but he barely flinched his head. I could hear him laughing again, that same sick twisted laugh that echoed in my head like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. With no other choice, I sprang past him, ducking under his outstretched arms, and ran toward the motel room door. I threw it open and ran outside into the night, my feet pounding against the gravel as I headed toward the RV. I didn't look back, but I could hear him behind me, those heavy boots crunching on the ground getting closer. His eyes met mine, and, for the first time, I saw something other than madness in them, something cold, calculated. He wasn't just some random drifter. He had planned this. When I finally got the door unlocked, I threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I locked it and backed away, panting, trying to catch my breath, but he was already there. His face appeared at the window, the same grin spreading across his bloodied face, the glass fogging up with his breath, and he tapped on the window like he was trying to get it open, without using the keys, was teasing me. My thoughts were racing, and I knew that if I didn't fight back, I wouldn't survive this. I grabbed the shotgun I kept in the RV as my last line of defense, but I hadn't used it in years. I loaded it, my hands still shaking, and pointed it at the door. I shot, and the bang was so loud in the tiny room that the glass broke. I took a step back, but it struck him, and I watched him stumble, blood gushing from his for a brief while. There was silence as he slumped back, falling hard on the dirt outside the RV. My breath felt ragged throughout my body, aside from the ringing in my ears. I walked closer to the window, shivering as I looked at his figure, waiting for any movement. My heart is still pounding as I watch for the smallest movement, but he simply lay there with his chest heaving once before leaving. I waited for him to come back to life, keeping my finger on the trigger, but I remained there for what seemed like hours, unable to move my thoughts, and he didn't move. After a moment of attempting to comprehend what had happened, I lowered the shotgun and my arms. I was so tired that I was afraid to leave the RV and instead sat down in the driver's seat, gazing at his lifeless body through the broken window. I eventually contacted the police in the morning, and when they got there, they discovered his dead right where I had left it. The sheriff, after glancing at the site, an elderly man with a thick beard and a weary expression, shook his head and said, He knelt beside the body and whispered, "Lucky you made it out alive." A few days later, they were able to identify the man. Harold Motson was a convicted murderer who had escaped from a mental hospital 5 years prior. He has been living there since then, off the grid ever since the cops began pursuing hikers and campers who ventured too far into the woods, searching for him. But it's simple because the San Juan National Forest is a large area. It was easy to get lost there, and I didn't feel fortunate. Instead, I felt exhausted, like I was barely alive after something I couldn't even fully understand. But the sheriff was correct. I had survived. That was more than the majority of individuals who knew Harold Motson could claim. They assured me that they would take care of the body, that everything was finished. But even today, as I sit here in my peaceful little town, I am unable to get rid of the sensation that some things simply stick with you. Perhaps that was Harold Motson's intention all along.